Welcome to the deep dive.
Oh, wait.
And today we are really going deep. We're going to be exploring the Zang Fu, the organ systems of traditional Chinese medicine.
Yeah.
And we will be drawing our insights primarily from Jeremy Ross's book, Zang Fu, the organ systems of traditional Chinese medicine.
Right.
So if you're interested in TCM, if you're interested in how the body is viewed as a holistic, interconnected system from that perspective, this deep dive is for you.
Yeah, this is going to be really interesting. I think one of the things that's so cool about studying this system is how different it is from a typical Western medical model.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be getting into all of that.
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, chapter one kind of lays the groundwork for this really different way of thinking about the body. It talks about how Western thinking really likes to analyze things by breaking them down to smaller and smaller parts.
Right.
Whereas the Chinese view is all about seeing the universe and by extension, the body as this interconnected network of energy flows.
Totally, yeah. It's about these patterns of change in interrelationship.
Right.
One thing I think that's interesting to think about is that Western medicine often wants to find like that one cause, like what is the thing that's causing this problem?
Yeah.
And then if we can just like eliminate that one cause, the problem will be solved.
Yeah.
But in TCM, it's not that simple. It's more about understanding the whole picture and how different aspects of your body and your environment are interacting.
Right. So instead of like isolating a problem, it's more about seeing how everything fits together within a larger system.
Exactly. It's like thinking about a forest, right?
Right.
Western thought might analyze each individual tree, like its species, age, how healthy it is. But Chinese thought would zoom out and look at the whole forest ecosystem, like how are the trees interacting with the soil, the water, the animals, the weather, how changes in one element will affect the whole system.
Yeah. So it's a much more holistic view.
Absolutely.
And this idea of everything being connected kind of leads us to the concept of yin and yang,
Yeah, yin and yang.
which, we've all heard of yin and yang, but it's much more than just a simple duality of opposites.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
for sure.
It's more dynamic than that.
Way more dynamic.
Yeah.
In TCM, yin and yang are really about these two interdependent and constantly transforming aspects of reality.
Right.
They don't exist in isolation,
Hmm.
One defines the other. They rely on each other. Like think about hot and cold. You can't understand hot without also understanding cold.
Right.
They kind of define each other.
Yeah.
And they're always in this dance, constantly shifting and influencing each other within your body and in the world around you.
Now, the book talks about this idea of precision and ambiguity in TCM terminology.
Mhm.
And it seems like there's this incredibly detailed system for categorizing things, but at the same time, there's also this flexibility in how you interpret those categories,
Right.
which seems like it could be kind of tricky for someone who is coming from a more, strict scientific background.
Yeah, I could see how that would be tricky. I mean, on the one hand, TCM does offer this like really sophisticated and detailed system for diagnosing and understanding imbalances.
Right.
But yeah, the language can sometimes seem ambiguous
Yeah.
to those of us who are used to, more rigid definitions that we might find in Western science.
Right.
But I think this flexibility actually allows for a more nuanced understanding of the, ever-changing nature of disharmony in the body.
Yeah.
It's less about fitting everything into neat little boxes and more about recognizing these patterns of imbalance,
Right.
which allows practitioners to really tailor their approach to each individual person.
So with all this talk of balance and patterns and interrelationships, what's the ultimate goal here? What's the guiding principle that underpins TCM practice?
Well, the fundamental principle is really this idea of harmony and disharmony.
Okay.
And so TCM practice is all about trying to figure out when that dynamic balance within your body has been disrupted and then working to restore that harmony.
Gotcha.
It's like, tuning an instrument, right?
Yeah, right. When all the parts are in tune, you get this beautiful music that flows smoothly. But when something's out of tune, it just creates this dissonance.
Yeah.
And so TCM is really about retuning your body's systems so that they can function harmoniously.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, after kind of laying this groundwork, this kind of philosophical groundwork, the book moves on to the framework of TCM.
Okay.
And it seems like, instead of focusing so much on the actual physical structures of the body like you'd find in an anatomy textbook, TCM is really more concerned with how everything functions together.
That's right. We're looking at functional interrelationships.
Right.
Your body is seen as this network of systems that are constantly influencing one another.
Right.
And so this framework is described as having four main interwoven categories. There are substances, Jingluo, Zhangfu, and Origins of Disease.
Okay.
And these aren't really viewed as like separate entities. They're all in this constant state of interaction.
Right, right. Okay, well, let's unpack this a little bit. Let's start with substances. Okay, substances.
Because it seems like that's pretty fundamental to how everything works, right? Okay. Chapter 3 lays out 5 key substances: qi, shu, jinye, jing, and shen.
Right.
And so let's just start with qi. What exactly is qi in this context?
Yeah. Gee.
I mean, it's often translated as energy or vital force, but it seems like it's even bigger than that, right?
It's huge. It's much more than just energy.
Right.
It's the fundamental life force that animates everything in your body. It's what makes you you.
Right.
And so it has many different functions. It moves things like blood and fluids. It warms the body, transforms substances. It protects you from external factors. It retains things in their proper place, and it nourishes your tissues.
Wow.
It does a lot.
Yeah, it's busy.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like there are different types of qi, too.
Yes. There are many different types.
Like yuan qi, gu qi, what are these all?
Right. It's a whole spectrum. So let's just break down a few key types so that you can kind of wrap your head around it. We have yuan qi, which is also known as original qi.
Okay.
And this is your fundamental constitutional qi that you inherit from your parents at birth.
Okay.
And it's super closely tied to jing, which we're going to talk about in a little bit.
Gotcha.
Then you have gu qi, also known as grain qi.
Okay.
And this is derived from the food and drink that you consume.
Okay.
It's kind of like the first stage of extracting energy from what you eat.
Gotcha.
And this is mainly carried out by your spleen and stomach.
Okay.
We'll talk more about those in a bit as well. Then we have Zang qi, which is gathering qi. And this is formed in your chest area.
Okay.
It's kind of a combination of gu qi, that green qi, along with the air that you breathe in through your lungs.
Okay.
Then you have Zen qi, or true qi. And this is like the final refined stage of transformation of that Zang qi.
Okay.
And it has 2 main aspects.
Okay.
It has yin qi, which is nutritive qi, and this circulates more on the deeper level of your body and directly nourishes your organs. And then you have wei qi, which is defensive qi, and this circulates more superficially, and it protects you from those external pathogens that we were talking about earlier.
Okay, cool. So that gives us a pretty good picture of qi.
Yeah.
It's many forms and functions.
It's a big one.
Yeah. What about zhu, which is blood?
Blood.
I mean, its function seems maybe a little bit more straightforward. It nourishes and moistens, but how is it formed according to TCM?
Right. So shu is formed from gu qi. Remember, we were talking about that grain qi?
Right.
So it's actually formed from that through a process involving the spleen and the lungs.
Interesting.
And it's seen as a more dense material manifestation of qi.
Okay.
It's what carries that nourishment and moisture to all the tissues and organs in your body.
Okay.
So you can think of qi kind of as the driving force and shu as the substance that it's carrying.
Okay.
They work together.
Next up, we have jin ye, which are the body fluids. And their main job is also to moisten and nourish, but it sounds like there's a distinction between jin and ye.
Yeah, there is a difference.
What is that?
So jin are the lighter, clearer fluids, like your sweat, your tears, saliva.
Okay.
And they circulate pretty quickly.
Okay.
And then you have ye, which are more dense, heavier fluids. And these are found in your joints, your brain, your internal organs.
Gotcha.
And they provide more substantial, deeper level moisture.
Gotcha.
And it's interesting, the book points out that in TCM, the terms jin, ye, and water are often used interchangeably.
Okay.
So just be aware of that.
Good to know. Then we have jing, which is essence.
Jing.
And this sounds really important, like this fundamental reserve of life force.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Yeah.
Jing is essential.
The book talks about prenatal and postnatal jing.
Right.
What's the difference there, and why is jing so important?
Okay, so jing is considered to be your most fundamental life substance. It determines your constitution, your vitality, your capacity for growth, for reproduction, for everything.
Wow.
So prenatal jing is what you inherit from your parents at conception. It's your genetic blueprint.
Okay.
And it's a finite amount, and it decreases over your lifetime.
Okay.
Postnatal jing, on the other hand, is derived from the nutrients that you extract from food, the air you breathe. So that's what you kind of take in after birth.
Okay.
And it helps to replenish and support that prenatal jing, although it can't fully replace it.
Okay.
So jing is stored in the shen, or the kidneys, which are seen as this like the root of your vitality in TCM.
Okay.
And it plays a crucial role in your development, your sexual health, your longevity. Big deal. And yuan qi, that original qi that we're talking about, is really dependent on this jing.
Okay.
So yeah, Jing is essential.
All right, and finally we have Shen,
Shen,
which is spirit.
spirit, yeah.
And again, the book mentions prenatal and postnatal aspects of this. So where does Shen reside in the body, and what's its role in TCM?
Right. So Shen in TCM is way more than just spirit in the kind of like typical Western sense.
Right.
It's your mind, your consciousness, your mental clarity, emotional well-being, your vitality, and even your personality.
Wow, it's a big one.
It's everything. So prenatal Shen is that innate aspect that you're born with, kind of like your inherent spark of consciousness.
Okay.
And then postnatal Shen is what develops throughout your life, influenced by your experiences, your emotions, how you nourish your body, all that good stuff.
Okay.
And Shen is said to primarily reside in the Jin, which is the heart.
Okay.
And in TCM, the heart is kind of like the emperor of all the organs.
Right.
So when your heart is healthy, your blood is abundant, your Shen is said to be rooted and stable, and you have that mental and emotional well-being.
So these 5 substances are obviously not just like existing independently within us.
No.
There are some important interrelationships and dependencies between them.
Oh, definitely. So, for example, Qi is considered to be yang in nature,
Okay.
compared to more yin substances like Jing and Shui,
Yeah.
the blood.
Right.
So Qi propels the circulation of Shui. Shui nourishes the Qi. Jing provides the basis for the generation of Qi. And Shen is rooted in the health of all the other substances.
Right.
So if you have like a deficiency in Jing or Shou, for example, that can actually impact the stability and clarity of your Shen.
Right.
So it's all interconnected.
They're all kind of playing off each other.
They all depend on each other.
So what happens when these fundamental substances become out of balance?
Right.
Like, are there certain patterns of disharmony that can arise?
Oh, there are a lot. And Table 3.4 in the book actually outlines some of these basic patterns of substance disharmony.
Okay.
So you might have deficient Qi, which can lead to fatigue and weakness. Deficient Yang, you feel cold and you just lack energy.
Yeah.
Deficient Shui, which can result in poor nourishment of tissues and dryness. Deficient Yin, which often presents as heat, dryness, restlessness. You also have patterns of stagnation, like stagnant Qi,
Right.
which is when that smooth flow of energy is blocked. So you might have distension, discomfort, and then there's stagnant Zhu, where the blood flow is impaired, so you might experience pain in certain areas.
Gotcha.
And then finally, there's disharmonies of Shen.
Okay.
And this can show up as deficient Shen, where you're feeling apathetic, kind of foggy-headed,
Right.
or disturbance of Shen, where you're agitated, restless, can't sleep.
So it can kind of go in either direction.
Either direction. It can be too much, it can be too little.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've covered these potential causes of disharmony. Let's move on to chapter 4, which is origins of disease.
All right, origins.
It seems like TCM has a pretty unique way of looking at how illness develops, kind of taking into account the body, various disease factors, and the resulting pattern of disharmony.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. TCM really wants to look at the big picture.
Yeah.
You know, how do all of these different internal and external factors interact to create disease?
Right.
So it's not just about like, oh, you have this bacteria or this virus. It's about understanding how your internal constitution and state, those disease factors, and the specific way that that imbalance manifests all come together to create the pattern of disharmony that we see.
And so these disease factors, are they categorized in TCM?
Yeah.
How so?
So there are 3 main categories. You have external factors, internal factors, and miscellaneous factors.
All right.
So the external factors are also known as the 6 pernicious influences.
Okay. And those sound kind of like different weather conditions.
They really do. They are wind, cold, heat, dampness, dryness, and summer heat.
Right. Okay.
And so TCM sees these as external pathogenic factors that can invade your body, especially when your Wei Qi is weak. Remember that defensive Qi we were talking about?
All right.
So if that's weak, or if your exposure to these factors is excessive or prolonged, that's when you start to get sick. And each of these influences has its own characteristics, and it tends to cause particular types of health problems. And actually, tables 4.3, 4.7, 4.10, and 4.11, and 4.13 really go into detail about this.
Cool.
You know, for example, wind. Wind is often seen as the leading cause of a lot of these acute conditions. So you have symptoms that come on suddenly,
Right.
and they tend to move around the body, like a migrating pain. You know, one day it's in your shoulder, the next day it's in your knee.
Gotcha.
Whereas cold, that tends to slow things down, cause stagnation and pain. Heat speeds things up, can lead to inflammation, fever.
Right.
Dampness is heavy and sticky, causes feelings of heaviness, swelling, and often leads to more chronic, persistent conditions.
Gotcha.
Dryness depletes your fluids, so you have dry skin, dry cough, constipation. And then summer heat. Well, it's prevalent in the summer. It can cause high fever, dehydration, fatigue.
Right.
So it's all about understanding these external influences and how they can impact the body.
Okay, so those are the external challenges we face.
Right.
What about the internal ones?
The internal ones.
Those are the emotions, right?
Yeah, the
Okay.
emotions.
The 7 emotions.
The 7 emotions.
What are those?
So the 7 emotions in TCM are joy, anger, pensiveness, worry, sorrow, fear, and fright.
Okay.
Now, it's important to note that in TCM, these emotions are not seen as bad.
Right.
They're a natural part of life. Everybody experiences them. It's just when these emotions become excessive, prolonged, or suppressed in an unhealthy way that they can lead to problems.
Okay.
And each of these emotions has a particular affinity for a specific organ system.
Interesting.
We're going to get into that a little bit more later, but yeah.
So it's not just like, if you're angry all the time, you're going to have bad relationships.
Right.
It's also, according to TCM, you're going to be affecting specific organs.
Exactly. It can manifest physically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about those miscellaneous factors? It sounds like a pretty broad category.
It's kind of a catch-all.
What goes in there?
So miscellaneous factors would be things like improper diet, eating too much, eating the wrong types of foods, eating at irregular times.
Okay.
Overwork, which can deplete your qi and blood.
Yeah.
Lack of exercise.
Yeah.
That can lead to stagnation.
Right.
Physical trauma, so injuries. And even parasites.
Okay.
So all these things that can kind of contribute to the development of disease by weakening your body's overall balance.
So we've covered these potential causes of disharmony. Let's move on to patterns of disease, chapter 5.
Okay, patterns.
And it seems like TCM diagnosis is really all about recognizing these underlying patterns rather than just labeling diseases with, Western terms.
Right. That's a huge difference in thinking.
Right.
So in TCM, it's not just about like, oh, you have a cold. It's about what is the pattern of disharmony that is underlying all of these symptoms.
Right.
So it's a much more holistic approach to diagnosis.
Gotcha. And this pattern diagnosis, it's based on a bunch of different things, right?
Yeah, several key concepts. It starts with yin and yang. Then there's the 8 principles. So that's looking at whether the condition is interior or exterior, cold or heat, deficient or excess.
Right.
And then, we also categorize patterns based on the state of those substances that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
The flow in the Jing-Luo channels, and of course, the Zang Fu organs themselves.
Right.
So it's all about taking all of those things into account to really understand what's going on.
And then there are these basic combined patterns.
Yes.
Right? Like excess in heat, deficient cold.
Right.
These sound like they describe even more complex situations.
They do, because that's really what we see in the clinic, right?
Right.
It's never as simple as like, oh, you have too much heat.
Right.
It's often you have too much heat and you're also deficient in this and that.
Right. Okay.
So these combined patterns really reflect how different imbalances can coexist and influence each other.
Right.
So you might have excess heat, which would be like, really strong pathogenic influence, inflammation, things are moving too fast. Or deficient cold, where you're lacking vital energy and things are kind of slow and sluggish.
Right.
And table 5.8 in the book actually gives you some examples of these common disease patterns.
Cool.
So it's worth taking a look at that.
Okay, so I think we've laid a lot of groundwork.
Yeah, so.
Now we can finally talk about the Zang Fu organs themselves.
Yes.
Chapter 6, kind of acknowledges that this can be a source of confusion for people who are coming from a Western medical perspective.
Oh.
Why is that?
Well, I think it's because the Zang Fu are not just anatomical organs in the way that they're understood in Western medicine.
Okay.
So, well, there is obviously some overlap, like the liver is the liver.
Right.
The Zang Fu in TCM are really more like functional entities. They're defined by their roles, their responsibilities, and their relationships with other organs in the TCM model.
Okay.
So it's really more about understanding their energetic roles and connections rather than just their physical structure.
Yeah. Right. So it's less about the actual organ and more about what it does within the entire system. Exactly. Okay, well, let's start with the Shen, chapter 7.
The Shen.
Which correspond to the kidneys in Western medicine.
All right.
And the Pengguang, the bladder.
The bladder.
So what are the Shen? What do they do?
So the Shen, they're a big deal. They're often called the root of life in TCM.
Wow.
And one of their primary functions is to store Jing.
Okay.
Remember that essential life force?
Right, right.
So they store that. And because of that, they also rule your birth, growth, development, reproductive capacity.
Okay.
They're also seen as the fundamental source of both yin and yang energies in your body.
Wow.
So they provide this foundation for all the other organ systems.
Okay.
The Shen also play a huge role in regulating your body's fluids. They rule water, which means they control the flow and transformation of fluids.
Okay.
They also help with the reception of qi, drawing air down from the lungs to the lower part of your body. And the health of your Shen is reflected in your hair.
Interesting.
And they open into the ears, influencing your hearing.
So they're really busy.
Super busy.
Yeah, they do a lot. So what happens when they become disharmonious?
Right.
What kind of signs and symptoms might you experience?
Well, disharmonies of the Shen can really manifest in a lot of different ways
Okay.
because they're so important.
Right.
So you might have deficiency of prenatal Jing,
Okay.
and that can lead to like congenital weaknesses, developmental delays.
Okay.
Excessive sexual activity is thought to deplete your Jing over time.
Okay.
Deficient Shen Jing can show up as lumbar soreness, weak knees, problems with fertility, poor memory, tinnitus.
Okay.
Deficient Shen Yang, which is that warming energy of the kidneys, you might have aversion to cold lower back and knees, reduced sexual drive.
Okay.
If the Shen Qi is not firm, you might have issues with incontinence or premature ejaculation.
Okay.
Shen failing to receive Qi can lead to shortness of breath, kind of like asthma. Water overflowing, that's when the kidney's ability to regulate fluids is impaired.
Okay.
So you might have edema, especially in the lower body. Deficient Shen Yin, you might have lumbar soreness, malar flush, night sweats.
Okay.
And finally, damp heat in the pangguang, the bladder, is going to show up as difficult, painful urination.
Okay.
So there's a lot.
Yeah. So many different ways that it can show up. Okay, let's move on to the Pi, chapter 8.
The Pi.
Which corresponds to the spleen in Western medicine.
Right.
And the Wei, which is the stomach.
The stomach.
So what are the primary roles of these organs in TCM?
Well, the Pi and the Wei are all about digestion.
Okay.
So the Pi rules transformation and transportation.
Okay.
So it extracts those essential nutrients from the food and drink that you consume, and it distributes those nutrients to all your tissues.
Okay.
It also governs your muscles and limbs, so it gives them energy and strength.
Okay.
The Pi also holds up the organs, which means that it prevents them from prolapsing or sinking. It holds up Zhu, the blood, so it helps to prevent bleeding disorders.
Gotcha.
And the health of your Pi is reflected in the condition of your mouth and your lips.
Okay.
The Wei, or the stomach, is responsible for receiving food and initially breaking it down.
Okay, so it's like the first stage of digestion.
The first stage.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if these organs are not functioning well, what kind of things can happen?
Well, a lot of digestive issues, obviously.
Right.
So deficient Pi Qi often leads to things like poor appetite, fatigue, abdominal distension after eating, loose stools. Deficient Pi Yang, that's the warming aspect of the spleen. You might have cold limbs, undigested food in your stool.
Okay.
If the Pi can't govern Zhu, you might see bleeding disorders. So easy bruising, nosebleeds. Sinking of Pi Qi can lead to prolapse of organs like the uterus or the rectum. Invasion of the Pi by cold and damp can cause, poor appetite, a feeling of fullness and heaviness in the abdomen, loose stools. Damp heat accumulating in the Pi can cause poor appetite, nausea, a feeling of heaviness, and a yellow, greasy coating on your tongue.
Interesting.
And then, interestingly, you can also have turbid phlegm disturbing the head.
Okay.
And this is where that impaired ability of the Pi to transform and transport fluids leads to this accumulation of dampness and phlegm.
Gotcha.
And that can cause dizziness, a feeling of heaviness in the head.
Okay, so we've got the Shen and the Pi.
Right.
Let's move on to the Gan, chapter 9.
The Gan.
Which corresponds to the liver.
The liver.
And the Dan, which is the gallbladder.
Right.
So what are their key functions in TCM?
Okay, so the Gan, or the liver, has a lot of really important functions.
Okay.
So it rules the free flowing of qi. So we're talking about the smooth movement of energy, blood, and emotions throughout the whole body.
Wow.
So when liver qi is flowing smoothly, you feel balanced, you feel even tempered.
Right.
The liver also stores qi, or blood, and it helps to regulate its volume and distribution. It rules the tendons, so it affects their flexibility and strength.
Okay.
And the health of your liver is reflected in your eyes.
Interesting.
So that, the clarity of your vision.
Yeah.
And it also manifests in your nails.
Okay.
So the Dan, or the gallbladder, is really closely linked to the liver.
All right.
It stores and excretes bile, which aids digestion.
Right.
And it's also thought to influence decision-making and courage.
Wow.
Yeah,
So the liver doing a lot.
a lot. It's a busy organ.
Yeah. So if it's not functioning properly, it can lead to more than just physical symptoms.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What are some of the common patterns of disharmony in these organs?
Okay, so one that we see a lot in the clinic is depression of Gan-Qi,
Okay.
also known as liver qi stagnation.
Right.
And this can lead to feeling distension in the chest and abdomen, poor digestion. You might be irritable, frustrated, even depressed.
Okay.
Deficient Gan-Su, or liver blood deficiency, can manifest as a dull, pale complexion, blurred vision, dizziness, brittle nails. Hyperactive Gan-Yang, or ascending liver Yang, that's where you might get headaches, dizziness, irritability, a flushed face.
Okay.
Blazing Gan-Fire, this is a more severe pattern.
Yeah.
One have a red face, red eyes,